What's your view on whether there's a boys' club, so to speak? So one thing I remember hearing from millennial women when they were sort of starting out in professional services firms, and I remember that there were these complaints about, well, it's still a bit of a boys' club, and I mean, this was in the 2010s, and I mean, I've worked before I worked for myself. I mean, I'd either work, well, I worked for a private consulting firm for a little bit, but before that, I worked in the public service largely, and that was relatively, I guess you'd say, progressive with regard to gender equality. But to hear that some of these firms are, there's still a boys' club element there. Is that still part of it?
Look, I think in some organizations, in some workplaces, and in some pockets, those traditional ways of thinking and operating, either consciously or unconsciously, are still in existence. And there are studies to support this type of stuff, Jean. There's a study from his colleagues at the Harvard Business School that looked at what they call schmoozing, so networking,
Yeah.
and how they look at networks amongst professionals and the gender patterns that exist, and they show that if you've got stronger networks of men, and because men are overrepresented in positions of power and influence, it tends to accelerate your career more so than if your network is female concentrated. So I think there's good reason to think that, anything that's still a vestige of history and the way things are traditionally done could be still tied up with gender patterned disadvantages and biases. It could just be the idea that, yeah, let's go and catch up for a drink after work, and that's where a lot of informal information is shared, and bonds, affinities are formed. And maybe some work-related decisions are made, and if you are a woman who has to go and pick up the children from school or childcare, you can't participate in those types of informal discussions, and so you are by default excluded from those important discussions. Now, it's not necessarily the case that the men are strategically planning that, but that's just the way that our gender patterned behaviors and roles at work or in society or at home can have either an advantageous or a disadvantage, disfavorable effect on people's opportunities to get really fair treatment. Another aspect I want to emphasize here, it's not just about opportunity and promotion pay, it's also about recognition and voice and influence. And so coming back to one of the themes of the network, the Women Economics Network, is also not just to try to support women's greater representation. Representation doesn't matter much, or doesn't amount to much if it doesn't translate into impact and respect and recognition and voice. And so, for instance, we've been more mindful about raising awareness about women economists having a voice in the media and being amongst the keynote speakers at the Australian Conference of Economists. You'll notice that representation has increased over time since when it was created, and raising awareness about the way that women's contributions have traditionally been less acknowledged or less elevated or given less weight in decision making, which obviously matters if we're talking about policy as well. So it's representation and recognition of contribution that also matters here. And so we have, for instance, the media register, which is there to have a pool of female economists who are available to speak to the media, to speak at conferences, to engage with the wider public. Some of the really interesting research that's come through from people who specialize in media analysis. So there was a recent report titled Women for Media, which conducted a content analysis of who were the experts that were being quoted or sourced in Australia's news media. And they ran a content analysis of all the articles, a big selection of articles, But this was conducted in May last year during the time of the budget. And so they categorized it according to different topics. And they found that female experts constituted 1/4 of the sources who were quoted for topics related to business, economics, and the federal budget. So 1/4 were females, as in 3/4 were men, and men were also overrepresented in op-eds and commentary, which basically means women economists are having less voice when it comes to public commentary and the potential for influencing what topics are highlighted by the media discussion. So that's where, you know, the male journalists are more likely to turn to their existing, if you want to call it a boys club, or their existing, you know, list of names and addresses of people they know. And the female journalists, we've been informed, are more likely to turn towards female experts. Now, we're not prescribing that's the way it should be, but that's just what seems to be happening because of the bonds or the affinities that are formed. And so we want to really, you know, break down those patterns so that, you know, these outcomes shouldn't be predictable on the basis of gender.